All right, so it looks like we're back in recording. At least what I'm seeing on my video seems kind of spotty, so if it's messing up for you guys, I'll turn the camera off. Just let me know. So let's continue on with our discussion over here with the specialization generalization. So this relationship over here, we've already talked about, right? The optional and. Again, meaning that staff can be one of these, but doesn't have to be. And it can be more than one of these. So it can be a manager and a salesperson now. So a sales manager or something like that. Okay, so what about this other one? So this, notice that this is the opposite. It's mandatory or. Okay, so mandatory being the opposite of optional. Mandatory means it must be one of these. So staff must be either full-time permanent or part-time temporary. Right? There is no other option. They can't just be a regular staff. There's nothing that would be something besides those two options. Okay, so let's see. Another aspect of this. So this would be similar. So mandatory here would be similar to saying that the parent class was abstract. Okay, so now notice that this is different, very, very different from the way this would be done in UML or Java, right? That we couldn't have a class be a parent to these and be non-abstract, and be a parent to these and be abstract. Like there's no way that a class in UML and Java could be both abstract and not abstract. That's not possible, right? But here in our ER modeling, we can do it that way. We can say that for this side of things, for this parent class over here, that these are optional. So it could be just a staff or it could be one of these. But on this side, it's mandatory. If we have a staff person that exists, they must be one of these. Okay. The or is not like digital or. It's more like digital exclusive or. All right, so if you've had your digital design class, which you may have had already, I don't remember which semester you have that in, right? But this would be like an exclusive or, meaning that if it's one of these, it cannot be the other. So this would make sense in this example that you cannot have someone who is both full-time and part-time, right? So this is, so where this and would be both and, it can be both a manager and a sales personnel and a secretary is a possibility. This is, they must be full-time permanent or part-time permanent, either or, okay? So one or the other, but not both. All right, so let's look at some other examples. All right, let's move on. Oh, one other thing that we'll talk about that's different from your UML class and Java examples here. Notice here we have a sales manager could be a child of both a manager and a salesperson, where we have a special attribute that is only for those employees, those staff that are both a manager and a sales personnel. So they inherit, it inherits from both of these. So this sales manager person will not only have a staff number, a name, a position, a salary, they will also have a manager start date, a bonus, and a sales area, and a car allowance, and also a sales target. Okay. People who are just managers won't have a sales target because they're not a sales manager. People who are sales personnel won't have, just sales personnel will not have a sales target because they are not a manager. Okay, so it inherits from both sides. So this has, I guess this has some similarities to interfaces in Java, but don't try to force it into that that way of thinking, because these are going to be entities, which are more similar to classes in UML and Java. Okay, this is optional. So what this means is that a sales personnel doesn't have to be a sales manager. That makes sense. A manager doesn't have to be a sales manager. Also makes sense. All right. That this part of the relationship is not required. Okay. In the same way, this assistant secretary is a possible specialization of the secretary class, of the secretary entity. Okay. They have a special attribute for start date. Only assistant secretaries have this attribute. Okay, this is optional. It makes sense that if you have a single child of an entity like this, that it would be optional, because if it's mandatory, we would just put that into here, right? Because if this were mandatory, if a parent here had to have a child, if you are a secretary, you have to be an assistant secretary, then it would make no sense to have this relationship here. You would just take any attributes here and say, well, put them there. Because if a secretary exists, they have to have these attributes. Well, let's just put them in the secretary class and be done with it, and not have this extra inheritance thing going on. Okay, so. All right, so let's talk a little bit. Let's do a little bit of a final wrap up on that, and then we'll look at a few examples, and we'll end our day there. And then on Wednesday, what we will do is we will have we'll try to work out an example. Okay, I'll try to prepare an example for Wednesday, and then we can kind of draw it out together. All right. Okay. All right. So there's two. One is a participation, meaning the mandatory or optional, right? And then the disjoint would be the and the or. Okay, let me draw those differently. Let me draw and or as. Hopefully you guys remember the dot notation, or you know of the dot notation in digital design, and the or notation. Okay, so it's either or. You could, I guess I could have also drawn it as what is it, and or, right? Or if you want to go back to our Java days, right? And or, right? Okay. So our has down here, participation constraint can be mandatory or optional. We either require our parent, if we have some row or something that exists in the parent class, it must be a member of the child class. Okay, of a child class. Optional, we can have something that is just the parent class. It doesn't have to be a member of the child class. Okay. The disjoint constraint. I don't like disjoint as a word. It's too. It's not used in English and in American English enough for me to feel like you guys need to know that. What I want you to remember is I want you to remember and or. Okay. I want you to remember that it can be more than one member of a child class. Again, this is different from your Java, right? Your Java experience. That if something was a child class, it couldn't be both. It wasn't possible. You couldn't have a fruit that was both an apple and a banana, right? Or an apple and an orange. Like, that's just not possible. It's either one or the other. Right, so you were used to or being, you were used to the or part, right? Now we have this and option where it can be more than one of a child. Okay. All right, so there's 4 different possible ways that we can combine this. We could have optional, we could have mandatory and optional and mandatory or optional or. Okay. So let's look at a couple of examples of how this works out. Okay, we already talked about managers and what sales and secretaries, but what about this supervisor where specific subclasses have relationships with other classes? So here we have an optional or, okay, optional or, meaning we can't have a staff person that's just a staff, right? We can have someone who's a supervisor. What does the or mean? It means if they're a supervisor, can they be a manager? Can they be a supervisor and a manager? How does or work? Right, only one. So if you're a supervisor, you can't be a manager. If you're a manager, you can't be a supervisor. If you are, you can be just a staff. You don't have to be a supervisor or manager. Me, I'm not a supervisor. I'm not a manager. I'm okay with that. Right? Okay. So here we have, if you're a supervisor, you'll have one or more staff that you're supervising. Remember the way that this was done before? The way that we showed this before was this was what we called a recursive relationship. That was called supervises, right? But now we've been able to move that to this to say particularly supervisors, people who are supervisors, are allowed to be supervising, so are allowed to supervise other staff. Right? Remember before, you could put anybody in as your supervisor, technically. All right, there was no rules on this. So now, if we have someone who is a supervisor, they will be supervising a staff. Now, why this? This doesn't make sense, does it? Does this make sense? Well, why 0 or 1? There's staff that I get the 1. I only have 1 supervisor. You don't want more than 1 supervisor, right? You don't want like 3, 4 supervisors, because then if they don't agree on stuff, then things just get really ugly, right? I mean, I guess at home you have 2 parents that are supervising you, which is hopefully you have 2 parents that are supervising you. So I guess that could work. But yeah, okay. In the work environment, yeah, so supervisors are staff too, right? So eventually, I think, Metatron, you might be getting at what I'm thinking is eventually, like let's say Joseph Hoja, right? So me. Who's my supervisor? You guys know? Who would be my supervisor? All right, Meli Hoja. So we'll call Meli, and make sure you don't confuse Meli Oz with Meli Gunai, because those are 2 different people, and it can get confusing around here. Okay, does he have a supervisor? Does he have? Do you think he has a supervisor? Yeah, the dean, right? What's it? I'm gonna. It's his name. Why am I blanking? Is it Shukru or Shukran? I can't remember. Somebody help me out. Shukru Hoja, yeah. Okay, surname. It's Shukru Ozan, right? Okay. All right. Does he? Hoja, does he have a? Does Shukra Hoja have a supervisor, or is he done? Are we done with him? The rector, yeah, Oslanen, right. Oskan, right. Does she have a supervisor? Does she have a supervisor? Yeah, but see, I agree. You got yoke president, or if I'm not mistaken, I believe that the rector position is appointed by the president of the country. If perhaps, I think that's the final sign off there, right? But someone probably in Ankara, right? As far as the university system that we are maintaining here, right? No one supervises the rector, right? There's no one in the university system that supervises the rector, right? And so that's probably why we have this not required aspect here, is because eventually we're going to get to someone who is not supervised by someone above them in the system that we are maintaining. Okay, so you get up to Oslan and Hoja, you get to the possibly the Yok president or whoever's her direct supervisor from Ankara. You're going to eventually get up to President Erdogan. You're eventually going to get up to that level, and then I guess technically in a democracy, the supervisor for the president becomes the people, right? So you maybe circle back around, right? But as far as the system that we are maintaining for the university, we have gotten to a place where someone doesn't have a direct supervisor within the university, right? Or in this case, within our dream home example. So that's why that relationship would be defined that way. Okay. We also already talked about the manages relationship. All right, so this is a way that we are able to take this recursive relationship and give it more structure and more ways that we can understand how to follow the business rules for this. Okay, all right, let's go on. Let's talk about another example. Okay, so now we have an owner, property for rent, private owner, business owner. Throw out some things that you understand from this diagram. Okay, what do you understand? Not just this new specialization generalization relationship, but in general about the diagram. What do you understand based on the relationships that are here? Okay. Okay, good. Metahan, good. So property must have one and only one owner, and an owner can own one or many properties. This requirement of an owner owning properties probably is a result of us saying, if someone doesn't own any properties, why are we tracking their information? Why are we keeping their information? Okay. An owner can be a private owner or a business owner, but not both, right? The or means they can't be both. Zer Haselin, yeah, the has to be, right? Mandatory. They must be one or the other. And so we combine that with Metahan's response and we say they have to be one or the other, but they can't be both. Okay. All right, good. So you guys have pretty much covered everything. Some other stuff that I won't talk about here. We can know what the primary key is for property for rent. We can also know primary keys for private owner and business owner as well. How that's going to work with the owner, why is there no primary key here? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in a future when we talk about design, specifically about logical design. Okay. All right. One final example. All right. What do we see here? Maybe some new people who haven't responded before. What do you see here in this example diagram? Okay, Arjun, let's see. This person must be staff, private owner, or client. And if he or she is a staff, it can be a supervisor or manager. Okay, yeah, good. Okay, so let's see. Must be staff, so that's you're catching up. You're catching on the mandatory part, right? Yep. Mandatory, staff, private owner, or client. And if that person is a staff person, that you're catching this relationship, they can be, not has to be, but can be optional, supervisor or manager. All right. And in both cases, we have an or distinctive here. We have an or here saying that, as Metahan points out, you can only be one of these. You can only be a staff or a private owner or a client. If you are a staff person, you can only be a supervisor or a manager. You can't be both. Okay. So, questions about this or here. So, they've designed it so that a staff person cannot also own property in our system. Does that seem reasonable? If you are a staff person, you cannot also own property. If you are a staff person, you cannot also rent. The clients would be the people who rent the properties. What do you think? Oh, yeah. Does this seem like a reasonable thing to you? Oh, sorry. Okay. So this pointing out of this or here, this is this or right here. So this was somebody designed this so that you could only be a staff or a private owner or a client. You cannot be more than one of these things. So basically what that's saying is if someone is a staff person who works for our company, they cannot also own a property. If someone's a staff person, they cannot also rent a property. That's what a client does. This is the I think a kiraja, right? Right. They cannot also rent property. Does that seem reasonable to say that an owner can't rent also, or a staff person can't rent, or a staff person can't own? Does that seem like a good design decision? What if one of our staff people gets some money and wants to own a property? Yeah. It could be, yeah, it could be bad business to not allow. It'd be nice, right, if I was an owner, yeah. I think probably the way around this would be in the probably most likely rare circumstance where a person who works for our company also wants to be an owner of a property and post it and host it with our company. They might just have a separate account for that purpose. So I'll give you, for example, we have here in this system, before we used Microsoft Teams, we used Google Classroom. And I have two separate accounts. One I used as the instructor of the course, but then I had a separate account that I used and made that account a student in the course. And that was done so that I could see what the students were seeing. So I could make sure that the students were seeing the assignments appropriately and things like that. All right, so I just have two separate accounts, and I think that's probably what we would require in this type of situation, where if you became an owner, you would just have a separate owner account with a different number, a different ID, you know, stuff like that, most likely. All right, so that ends our examples. That ends our set of slides. As you can see now, we're done. End of the show. Are there any comments or questions before we dismiss? All right. Yeah, you too, Metahan, and the rest of you as well. All the silent members of our meetings here. Hope you guys have a good weekend, and look for, there will be a new assignment coming eventually. It will include things related to what we've talked about here with ER modeling, and I can guarantee you ER modeling will be a big part of your upcoming midterm exam in a few weeks. Okay, all right, have a good afternoon and weekend, and I will see you guys next week, next Wednesday.